I spent 36 years being invisible in my own family. Not the kind of invisible where people forget your birthday. The kind where your mother looks right through you while hanging your sister's promotion letter on the refrigerator. The kind where your father asks about your job and walks away before you finish answering. But I never expected this. "Look at my sister here," Amelie announced at dinner. Champagne glass raised a smirk curling across her face. She pointed directly at me. "This is what failure looks like, a complete nobody." The whole table erupted in laughter. My father, my mother, my uncle, even the cousins. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, the clink of glasses, the sting of tears I refused to let fall. Amelie had just been promoted to director. She made sure everyone knew it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was where her new company had just transferred her. And when she walked into that executive wing the next morning and saw my name on the door, everything changed. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most? My name is Kristen Bowman. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've served as Vice President of Operations at Hartwell Corporation, one of the largest conglomerates in the Midwest. I oversee a department of 200 employees, manage multi-million-dollar budgets, and sit in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. None of my family knows any of this. I learned to stop sharing my accomplishments years ago. When I graduated summa cum laude from college, my parents forgot to attend the ceremony because Amelie had a dance recital. When I got my first management position at 28, my mother interrupted my announcement to show everyone Amelie's new headshots for her acting portfolio. After a while, I understood the pattern. My achievements were inconvenient. They took attention away from the person who needed it most. Amelie was always what my parents called sensitive. She cried easily. She struggled with criticism. She needed constant reassurance, so they gave it to her endlessly. Every B+ was celebrated like a Nobel Prize. Every minor setback was treated like a tragedy requiring the whole family's attention. Meanwhile, I was expected to handle everything on my own. I was the strong one, the responsible one, the one who never needed anything. At least that's what they told themselves. The truth is, I needed plenty. I just stopped asking. That dinner last week wasn't unusual in its dynamics. It was only unusual in how far Amelie decided to push. The whole family had gathered at my parents' house to celebrate her promotion to director at Brighton Media. She had been talking about it for an hour straight, how important she was, how impressed her bosses were, how she was finally making it. I sat quietly eating my mother's pot roast and nodding at appropriate intervals. Then she turned to me. "You know what's funny," Amelie said, tilting her champagne glass in my direction. "Some people just peak in high school, and some people never peak at all." She laughed that bright, confident laugh she'd perfected over the years. "No offense, Chris. We can't all be winners." I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth. The table went quiet for a moment, then my father chuckled. My uncle joined in. My mother frowned slightly and murmured, "Amelie, don't exaggerate." But she didn't defend me. She just turned to ask my cousin about his new car. That was the defense I got. "Don't exaggerate." Not, "That's not true." Not, "Kristen has done very well for herself." Just a mild request for my sister to tone it down, followed by a swift change of subject. I helped clear the dishes afterward because that's what I always do. I was rinsing plates in the kitchen when my mother came in and lowered her voice. "You know," she said almost conspiratorially, "I saw the name Hartwell on some mail at your apartment last year. I know you work somewhere decent." She patted my arm. "But don't mention it to Amelie. You know how she gets. She'd be upset if she thought you were also doing well." I stared at her. She knew. She had known for at least a year that I worked at a major corporation, and she had chosen to keep it secret not to protect me, but to protect Amelie's ego. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I drove home in silence, my hands tight on the wheel, my chest aching with something I couldn't name. About halfway there, my phone buzzed, with a notification from our HR system. I glanced at it at a red light. Employee transfer list from Brighton Media Acquisition confirmed. New director, joining operations department, Amelie Bowman. Start date Monday. The light turned green. I didn't move. Someone honked behind me. Amelie was being transferred to Hartwell, to my department. She would walk into my building on Monday morning and discover the sister she called a nobody was the executive overseeing her entire team. I spent the entire weekend preparing myself. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would act, the exact expression I would wear on my face. By Monday morning, I had decided on one approach: complete professionalism. I would treat Amelie like any other employee. No special treatment, no confrontation, just work. Amelie arrived at Hartwell Corporation like she owned the building. I watched from my office window as she stepped out of her car in the executive parking lot sunglasses on a designer bag swinging from her shoulder. She paused at the entrance to take a selfie with the company logo behind her. Within minutes, I heard from my assistant that the new director from Brighton was already making an impression. She had told the security guard she needed a better parking spot. She had asked the receptionist if there was a separate elevator for senior leadership. She had introduced herself to 3 different people as one of the key talents Brighton brought over in the acquisition. I stayed in my office and let her settle in. The integration orientation was handled by HR, and I had no reason to be involved in her first day paperwork. But I knew eventually our paths would cross. Hartwell is a big company, but operations is my territory. Every director in that division reports up through my chain of command. It happened on her 3rd day. I was walking through the executive wing after a budget meeting when I saw her standing in the hallway chatting with one of the junior analysts. She was laughing, gesturing broadly, clearly, telling some story about her previous successes. Then she turned and saw me. The color drained from her face. For a moment, she looked like she had seen a ghost. The junior analyst, oblivious to the tension, smiled and said, "Oh, Ms. Bowman, have you met our new director?" "This is Amelie Bowman from Brighton. Amelie, this is Vice President Bowman. She oversees all of operations integration." Amelie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I watched her process it. The title, the office, the fact that her sister, the nobody, was the executive responsible for her entire department's transition. I kept my expression neutral. "Welcome to Hartwell, Ms. Bowman," I said. "I trust your onboarding has been smooth. If you have any questions about our protocols, my assistant can direct you to the appropriate resources." Then I nodded politely and walked away. I heard later that she stood in that hallway for a full minute after I left, not saying a word. Over the following weeks, Amelie settled into her role, but not in the way I had hoped. She completed her onboarding and received her limited signing authority, the standard $500,000 threshold for new directors. She attended the required trainings, though my assistant noted she spent most of them on her phone. And she began building her reputation, though not through hard work. Instead, Amelie chose a different strategy. She started telling people that I was jealous of her, that I had always resented her success, that I was using my position to make her life difficult. She bypassed my protocols whenever she could, submitting reports through alternative channels and scheduling meetings without following proper chains of communication. She sent emails that were just professional enough to avoid formal complaints, but dripped with condescension. One message copied to half the department referred to outdated procedures that some leaders seem personally attached to. I documented everything. Every missed protocol, every passive-aggressive email. Every instance where she bent the rules just enough to cause friction without crossing clear lines. I kept a folder on my computer labeled Brighton Integration Notes. It grew thicker every week. Then Rachel Torres asked to see me. Rachel was a senior manager who had also transferred from Brighton. She was quiet, competent, and had a reputation for solid work. She knocked on my office door late one afternoon and asked if we could speak privately. "I need to tell you something," she said, closing the door behind her. "And I need you to understand why I did not say anything before." She sat down across from me and took a deep breath. Then she told me about the Meridian Project. According to Rachel, the Meridian Project was the initiative that had gotten Amelie promoted to director. It was a major client acquisition strategy that had brought in significant revenue for Brighton before the merger. Amelie had presented it to leadership as her own creation. She had taken full credit in meetings and reports and in her performance reviews, but the project was not hers. It was Rachel's. Rachel had developed the entire strategy. She had the original drafts with her name on them. She had emails showing the timeline of her work months before Amelie ever touched the project. And she had messages from Amelie pressuring her to stay quiet, promising that recognition would come later, and warning that speaking up would not end well for her career. I was afraid, Rachel said. Amelie had connections at Brighton. I thought if I said anything, I would be the one who got pushed out. But now we are at Hartwell, and I cannot keep watching her take credit for things she did not do. I listened carefully. Then I told her what I believed was the right path forward. Submit everything to HR formally, I said. Document it properly. Do not send it to me directly because I have a personal connection that could complicate things. File it through the official channels. When the time comes, the truth will speak for itself. Rachel nodded and left my office. I sat alone for a long time after she was gone, thinking about what she had told me. 3 days later, I received an urgent notification from our legal compliance system. A vendor contract had been flagged for review. The signing authority was listed as Amelie Bowman. The contract value was within her limit, just under $500,000. But the terms were not. I opened the document and read through the penalty clauses. If Hartwell terminated the agreement for any reason within the first 2 years, we would owe the vendor $1.8 million in damages. Amelie had signed it without escalating it through the proper approval chain. She had not consulted legal. She had not flagged the unusual terms. She had just signed. My phone buzzed with a message from the CEO's assistant. Emergency meeting requested. CEO's office, 30 minutes. And I closed the contract file and stood up from my desk. Whatever professional distance I had tried to maintain was about to become impossible. The walk to the CEO's office felt longer than usual. Every step echoed in the quiet hallway, and I could feel my pulse quickening, despite my best efforts to stay calm. I had been in hundreds of executive meetings over the years, but none of them had involved my own sister sitting across the table as the subject of an emergency review. When I entered the main boardroom, CEO Margaret Hayes was already seated at the head of the table. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Beside her sat the chief financial officer, the general counsel, and the HR director, Sandra Whitmore. Amelie was seated at the far end of the table, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not look at me when I walked in. "Thank you for joining us, VP Bowman," Margaret said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We have a serious matter to discuss regarding a vendor contract that was signed without proper authorization. I trust you have reviewed the document." I nodded and took my seat. "I have." Margaret turned to Amelie. "Ms. Bowman, you signed a contract with Ventura Logistics that includes a termination penalty of $1.8 million. This was not escalated to legal or to the executive approval chain. Can you explain why?" Amelie straightened in her chair and lifted her chin. "With all due respect, the approval process here is extremely confusing. I came from Brighton, where we had streamlined procedures. No one at Hartwell explained the requirements clearly. I was told I had signing authority up to $500,000, and the contract value was under that limit. I had no way of knowing about the penalty clause." The general counsel leaned forward. "The penalty clause is on page 14 of the contract. Standard due diligence would require reading the full document before signing." Amelie's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "I was under significant time pressure. The vendor had a deadline, and frankly, I expected more support from the leadership team during my transition." She paused and glanced briefly in my direction. "I was not given adequate guidance. If anything, I felt like I was being set up to fail." The room went quiet. I understood what she was doing. She was trying to shift the blame onto me without saying my name directly. She wanted the executives to wonder if I had sabotaged her out of personal jealousy. Margaret's eyes moved to me. "VP Bowman, would you like to respond?" I opened the folder I had brought with me. I anticipated this might come up, I said, keeping my voice steady. So I prepared a timeline. I slid copies across the table to each person in the room. On Amelie's first day, she received an orientation email outlining all approval procedures for contracts above $250,000. The email was opened, but never acknowledged. On her 5th day, she was scheduled for a mandatory training session on vendor agreements. She did not attend. The system shows she marked herself as present remotely, but the session logs indicate she never joined. On 3 separate occasions before the Ventura contract was signed, automated reminders were sent about escalation requirements for contracts with non-standard terms. All 3 were deleted without being read. I looked up from the documents. I did not provide inadequate support. The support was offered, documented, and ignored. Margaret's expression hardened. She turned back to Amelie, who had gone pale. Is this accurate, Ms. Bowman? Amelie opened her mouth but said nothing. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. Before anyone else could speak, Sandra Whitmore, the HR director, cleared her throat. There is another matter I need to bring to the table, she said. 3 days ago, my department received a formal complaint regarding Ms. Bowman's conduct at Brighton Media prior to the merger. Amelie's head snapped toward Sandra. What complaint? Sandra opened her own folder. A senior manager named Rachel Torres has submitted documentation alleging that the Meridian project, which was cited as a primary reason for Ms. Bowman's promotion to director, was not her work. Ms. Torres claims she developed the entire strategy and that Ms. Bowman took credit for it. The room fell completely silent. I watched Amelie's face as the color drained from it entirely. Sandra continued. Ms. Torres has provided original drafts of the project proposal with her name and timestamps predating any involvement by Ms. Bowman. She has also submitted emails showing that Ms. Bowman pressured her to remain silent with messages including statements such as, "Speaking up would not end well for your career. Our legal team has reviewed the documentation and found it credible." Amelie's hands were trembling now. Her carefully constructed composure was cracking in real time. That is not true, she whispered, but her voice had no strength behind it. Rachel is lying. She is just jealous. Everyone at Brighton knew the Meridian project was mine. The evidence suggests otherwise, Sandra said flatly. Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied Amelie for a long moment. Ms. Bowman, is there anything you would like to say in your defense? And then Amelie broke. The tears came suddenly spilling down her cheeks as her composure shattered completely. She covered her face with her hands and let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. You do not understand, she said, her voice cracking. None of you understand what it was like. She lowered her hands and looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. I was always terrified of not being as good as her. My whole life, everyone said Kristen was the smart one. Kristen was the capable one. Kristen could handle anything. And I was just the one who needed extra help, the one who could not keep up. Her voice broke again. So I had to prove I was not less than her. I had to. I did not know any other way. The room was silent. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my sister fall apart in front of a room full of executives, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never considered. Amelie had been damaged too, not in the same way I was, not by being ignored, but by being coddled so completely that she never learned how to stand on her own. Our parents had crippled us both, just in opposite directions. Margaret let the silence hang for a moment. Then she turned to me. VP Bowman, you have a personal relationship with the employee in question. I will need you to formally recuse yourself from any decision regarding her future at this company. She paused. However, before I make my ruling, is there anything you would like to say for the record? I looked at Margaret and then at the rest of the executives seated around that long table. Every eye in the room was on me. My sister sat at the far end, her face streaked with tears, waiting to hear what I would say. This was the moment I could have destroyed her completely. I could have listed every cruel word she had ever spoken to me. I could have reminded everyone of the dinner where she called me a nobody in front of our entire family. I could have made sure she never recovered professionally, but that was not who I wanted to be. For the record, I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, I trust you to make a fair decision based on the evidence presented. I have a personal conflict in this matter, and I will respect whatever ruling you determine is appropriate. That is all I have to say. Margaret nodded slowly. She looked at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw something like respect in her expression. Then she turned back to face the room. Here is my decision, she said. Amelie Bowman will be demoted from director to senior manager effective immediately. She will be placed on a 90-day performance improvement plan with strict oversight. She will forfeit her annual bonus for this fiscal year, and she will issue a formal written apology to Rachel Torres to be reviewed and approved by HR before delivery. Margaret paused and fixed her gaze on Amelie. If you violate any of these terms, your employment will be terminated without severance. Do you understand? Amelie nodded weakly. She did not argue. She did not try to negotiate. I think she understood that her reputation was already too damaged to walk away and find something better elsewhere. She had no leverage left. The meeting ended, and I walked out without looking back. I went straight to my office, closed the door, and sat in silence for nearly an hour. I had done the right thing, I knew that. But it did not make me feel triumphant. It just made me feel tired. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my mother. "How could you?" she said before I could even say hello. Her voice was shaking with anger. "How could you do this to your own sister? She called us crying. She lost her title. She lost her bonus. She is humiliated in front of her entire company, and you just sat there and let it happen." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. "I did not let anything happen, Mom. Amelie made choices. She signed a contract she did not read. She stole credit from a colleague. She lied about her qualifications. Those were her decisions, not mine." "But you are her sister," my mother shouted. "You were supposed to protect her." Something inside me shifted. A door that had been locked for 20 years finally opened. "I have been silent for 20 years," I said quietly. "Today, I am going to speak." And then I told them everything. I told them about the time I graduated at the top of my class, and they forgot to come because Amelie had a recital. I told them about my first promotion when Mom interrupted me mid-sentence to talk about Amelie's headshots. I told them about every holiday dinner where my accomplishments were brushed aside and Amelie's smallest achievements were celebrated like national victories. I told them about the night she called me a nobody in front of the entire family, and how Mom's only response was to tell her not to exaggerate before changing the subject. The line went quiet. I could hear my father breathing in the background. He had picked up the extension at some point without speaking. "You always said Amelie needed more encouragement because she was sensitive," I continued. "But did you ever stop to think about what I needed? Did it ever occur to you that I might have wanted to be seen too?" My mother's voice was small now. "Kristen, we never meant to hurt you." "I know you did not mean to," I said. "But you did, and I carried it alone because I thought that was my job. The responsible one, the strong one, the one who never complains." I paused and let the silence stretch. Then I told them the rest. "Do you remember when the roof was repaired 3 years ago? You thought the contractor gave you a discount because he knew Dad from church. He did not. I paid for it, all of it." I heard my mother gasp softly on the other end. "And Dad's knee surgery 2 years ago. You thought insurance covered more than it did. It did not. I covered the rest anonymously through the hospital billing department. And the scholarship that helped Amelie finish her MBA. There was no scholarship. I created a fake award letter and paid the tuition myself because I knew you could not afford it, and I did not want her to drop out." The silence on the line was deafening. "But you never said anything," my father finally said. His voice was rough, uncertain. "Every time I tried to talk about my life," I replied, "you changed the subject to Amelie. So I stopped trying. I just helped from the shadows because that was the only role you ever gave me." Neither of them spoke. I could hear my mother crying quietly. "I love this family," I said. "I always have. But I will not accept being invisible anymore. I will not keep sacrificing in silence while being treated like I do not matter. If you want me in your lives going forward, you need to see me. Not as Amelie's sister, not as the backup, as Kristen, as who I actually am." I waited. For the first time in my life, my parents had no excuses. No deflections. No explanations about how Amelie needed more support. There was only silence. And somewhere in that silence, I heard the beginning of something that might have been shame. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my apartment for a long time. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel relieved. I just felt empty, like I had finally set down a weight I had been carrying so long I forgot it was there. 3 weeks passed. Life at work returned to something resembling normal. Amelie kept her head down and did her job. We did not speak outside of necessary professional interactions. I did not reach out to my parents, and they did not call me again. Then one evening, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was handwritten, addressed in careful script that I recognized immediately as Amelie's. But the return address was not her upscale apartment downtown. It was a modest address in a neighborhood across town I did not recognize. I stood in my doorway, holding the envelope, wondering what my sister could possibly have to say now. I opened the letter that evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, growing cold beside me. Amelie's handwriting was neat and careful, nothing like the rushed scrawl I remembered from birthday cards she used to sign without reading. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, and I noticed she had crossed out a few words here and there, as if she had struggled to find the right thing to say. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not make excuses. She simply asked if I would meet her at the park near our childhood home. She said she had things she needed to say, and she understood if I was not ready to hear them, but she hoped I would come. At the bottom of the letter, she had written one more line. I am not the person I was at that dinner table. I am trying to figure out who I should have been all along. I almost threw the letter away. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the silence between us stretch on indefinitely. The wounds were still fresh, and I was not sure I had the energy to reopen them. But something in her words felt different. There was no manipulation, no guilt, no subtle attempt to shift blame or make me feel responsible for her pain. Just a quiet request from someone who seemed for the first time in her life willing to be honest. I went to the park on a Saturday morning 3 months after the executive meeting. The weather was cool and gray, the kind of autumn day that makes everything feel still and heavy. Leaves had fallen across the walking paths, and the playground equipment stood empty, waiting for children who would not come until spring. Amelie was already there when I arrived, sitting on a wooden bench near the old oak tree where we used to play as children. I remembered climbing that tree when I was 8 years old, shouting for our mother to watch me. She had been too busy fixing Amelie's shoelace to look up. Amelie looked different, smaller somehow. She was not wearing designer clothes or expensive jewelry, just a simple gray sweater and faded jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had no makeup on. The confident woman who had pointed at me across a dinner table and called me a nobody was gone. In her place was someone who looked tired, uncertain, and strangely human. She stood when she saw me approach, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, filled with years of resentment and pain that words could never fully address. Then she gestured to the bench, and we sat down together, leaving a careful distance between us. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I was not sure you would." "I almost did not," I admitted. She nodded like she understood. Then she took a deep breath and looked out at the empty playground in front of us. A swing moved slightly in the breeze, creaking on its chains. "I have been thinking a lot," she said, "about everything. About the meeting, about what I did to Rachel, about what I said to you at that dinner." She paused and pressed her hands together in her lap. "And I realized something I never saw before, something I should have understood years ago." I waited watching her profile as she gathered her thoughts. "Mom and Dad always told me I was not as strong as you," she continued. "They said I could not handle pressure the way you could, that I needed more help, more encouragement, more protection, and I believed them. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me, something broken that made me weaker than my older sister." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were filled with something I had never seen in her before. Regret. Deep, genuine regret. "So I spent my whole life trying to prove I was not less than you. I lied. I manipulated. I took credit for things I did not do, because I was so terrified of being seen as the failure they always expected me to be." She shook her head slowly. "I was competing against someone who was never competing with me. You were just living your life building something real, and I was so busy trying to beat you that I never stopped to ask why. You never wanted to race. I invented the competition all by myself." I felt something shift inside my chest. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. For the first time, I saw my sister not as the golden child who had stolen all our parents' attention, but as another victim of the same broken family dynamics that had shaped me. They had made me invisible by ignoring my achievements. They had made her fragile by never letting her fail. "They damaged both of us," I said, "just in different ways." Amelie nodded slowly. "I know that now. I wish I had seen it sooner." She told me what had changed in her life since the meeting. She had moved out of her luxury apartment downtown, the one our parents had been helping her afford for years. She was living in a modest one-bedroom across town, paying the rent entirely on her own for the first time in her life. She had canceled her country club membership and sold most of her designer handbags. She had stopped eating out every night and started cooking her own meals, even though she burned the pasta more often than not. She had written a formal apology to Rachel Torres not because HR required it, but because she genuinely meant every word. And she had been working under Rachel's supervision without complaint, learning what it felt like to earn recognition instead of stealing it from someone else. "I am not asking you to trust me," she said. "I know I have not earned that. I just wanted you to know that I am trying, really trying. For the first time in my life, I want to be someone I can respect when I look in the mirror." I looked at her for a long moment. She was not the same person who had pointed at me across a dinner table and called me a nobody. Something had broken inside her that day in the boardroom, and she was slowly putting the pieces back together in a different shape. "Words are easy," I said finally. "But this is a start. I will believe in your change when I see it sustained over time. Not weeks, not months, years." She nodded and did not argue. That alone told me more than any apology ever could. A few weeks after that conversation, my parents came to visit me. It was the first time they had been to my apartment in over a year. They did not call ahead to ask for money. They did not mention Amelie's problems or complain about how hard things had been for the family. They just showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine and an old photo album I did not recognize. We sat together in my living room, and my mother opened the album to pages I had never seen before. Pictures of me as a child winning spelling bees and science fairs. Pictures of my high school graduation, where I had given the valedictorian speech to a crowd of hundreds. Pictures of my college years that I did not even know she had kept tucked away in a box in the attic all this time. "I forgot to mention these," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I forgot to tell you how proud I was. I do not know why. I think I was so focused on making sure Amelie felt good about herself that I stopped making sure you knew how special you were. That was wrong. I see that now." My father sat beside her, his hands folded in his lap. He had never been good with words, but when he spoke, his voice was rough with sincerity. "I am sorry we made you carry so much alone," he said. "You deserve to be seen. You always did. We failed you, Kristen, and I do not know if we can ever make that right, but we would like to try." I did not cry. I had done enough crying over the years, but I let myself feel the weight of their words, and for the first time I believed they meant them. This was not a performance. This was not an attempt to smooth things over so we could go back to the way things were. This was the beginning of something new. 2 months later, I was promoted to senior vice president. Margaret Hayes made the announcement personally at an all-hands meeting, citing my leadership during the Brighton integration and my commitment to fairness under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. My colleagues applauded. My team sent flowers to my new office. It was the recognition I had worked my entire career to achieve, and it came from people who had always valued me, even when my own family did not. That evening, I sent Amélie a small package. Inside was a copy of a book called Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. I tucked a handwritten note inside the front cover that read, "For someone learning to be brave in a new way, one day at a time." I did not expect a response, but the next afternoon, as I sat in my new corner office watching the sun set over the city skyline, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Amélie. "Rachel praised my work in today's meeting. First time I have ever been recognized for something I actually did. Thank you for not giving up on me." I read the message twice. Then I set my phone down and looked out the window at the city I had worked so hard to reach. That was the day I understood that real strength is not about revenge or proving others wrong. It is about standing up and saying I deserve respect and then living that truth every single day. Not everyone changes. Some people stay exactly who they have always been, no matter how many chances you give them. But at least I gave them the opportunity. And more importantly, I finally gave myself permission to be seen. And so that is where my story ends, at least for now. Not with a dramatic confrontation or a moment of ultimate revenge, but with something quieter and far more meaningful. A text message from my sister acknowledging for the first time that she had earned something on her own merit. A promotion that recognized the work I had been doing silently for years. And a family that was finally slowly learning to see me for who I really am. I spent 36 years waiting for my family to notice me. 36 years of being the responsible one, the invisible one, the daughter who handled everything without complaint, while her younger sister received all the praise and attention. I used to think that if I just worked harder, achieved more, gave more of myself, eventually they would turn around and see what I had accomplished. But that day never came, not until I stopped waiting and started speaking. The hardest part of this journey was not confronting my sister in that boardroom. It was not watching her break down and admit her deepest fears. The hardest part was giving myself permission to matter. For so long I had accepted the role my family assigned to me. I was the strong one who did not need anything. I was the backup, the shadow, the one who existed only in relation to Amelie. Breaking free from that identity meant accepting that I deserved better, and that was terrifying. But I did it. And if you are listening to this story and recognizing pieces of yourself in my experience, I want you to know that you can do it too. Maybe you have a sibling who always got more attention. Maybe you have parents who never seemed to notice your accomplishments. Maybe you have spent years giving and sacrificing for people who never thought to ask how you were doing. I understand. I lived that life for 3 decades, and I am here to tell you that the recognition you are waiting for might never come from the people you want it from. But that does not mean you are not worthy of it. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to take up space in your own life without apologizing for it. And sometimes the first person who needs to believe that is you. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? Have you ever had to stand up and demand the respect you deserved? Please share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters, and there are so many people in this community who will understand exactly what you have been through. Sometimes just knowing that someone else understands can make all the difference. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories like this one every week. Stories about resilience, about standing up for yourself, about finding your strength when everything feels impossible. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And if you found this video meaningful, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you are not invisible. You never were. Sometimes the world just needs a little time to catch up to how extraordinary you have always been.